The world of 911 emergency dispatching is brutally diverse. 1 minute you can be talking with someone about parking violations.
What's the process we are to take to have people towed? Because it's actually delaying the mail.
And then all hell can break loose. Then the rest of the day is crazy. We could have murders.
Hill County 911, what's your emergency?
I just killed my children.
Home invasions.
He's in my house. I shot him.
You shot him?
He was coming up towards me and I shot him.
Natural disasters.
Tornadoes next to the goddess. I'm buried under a bomb to roll my life.
Even bombings. My show, Music City 911, will put you in the dispatcher's chair, put you ear to ear with the callers and responders, and keep you on edge from start to finish. I hope to both educate and entertain, as I'm a 911 dispatcher with over 20 years experience. And just like dispatching, every episode is different from the last. Music City 911. Real 911 calls, real 911 dispatchers. Available to listen to on any podcast app.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reverie True Crime. I'm your host, Paige. Before we dive into the episode, I wanted to let you all know that the 2023 True Crime podcast calendars are still on pre-sale at podcastcalendars.com, and you can get an extra $5 off when you use the promo code REVERIE. I am extremely honored and so excited to be included with creators that I myself admire. Reverie True Crime was picked for the month of September, and I absolutely cannot say enough about the 11 other true crime podcasts that were chosen for the calendar. Alexis, the creator of the calendar, did a marvelous job with it. Personally, I think a true crime podcast calendar is such a cool and unique idea. Pick yours up today at podcastcalendars.com. That's podcastcalendars.com. And use the promo code REVERIE for $5 off. For almost 50 years, Ruth Marie Terry was only known as the Lady of the Dunes. On October 31st, 2022, it was announced to the world that she finally got her identity back. But that's not all to the story, and we're going to start from the very beginning. Let's get started. On July 26, 1974, a little girl around 12 or 13 years old named Laurie Metcalfe was staying with family at a cottage in the Cape Cod National Seashore in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Suddenly, she looked around and noticed that her dog, a beagle, wasn't around and had gone off on his own. She wondered where her curious dog could have gone. When a scent appeals to a beagle, their noses stay glued to the ground, and that smell is all they are fixated on. So she headed out on a mission to find her pooch. Laurie had walked to the sand dunes, which were about 100 yards away, and she heard the sound of that classic, typical bark of a beagle. She trailed his barks about 50 yards ahead, spotting him in a thicket of scrub pine. Her dog had found something that piqued his nose's interest. As Laurie looked to see what her dog couldn't keep his nose off of, she couldn't believe her eyes. According to her sister Alyssa, Laurie thought she was looking at a dead deer because of the color of its skin. She soon realized it was in fact a decomposing body. Laurie was terrified and she took off running. Later that day, Laurie, her mother, and a park ranger meandered off to the dunes so Laurie could show them what she saw. When they got there, the reddish-haired, green-eyed woman with her hair tied in a ponytail with a golden-colored ponytail holder was lying face down on a green beach towel. The woman's toenails were painted a pretty pink. Her ponytail was very disheveled and tangled around her shoulders. Both of her wrists had been hacked off and were not at the scene. Her Wrangler jeans and blue bandana were folded neatly beneath her head, saturated in blood. Her shirt would never be found. Part of the beach towel had been placed over her face. She was almost completely decapitated because whoever did this cut rigorously into her neck and her skull had been crushed in. A few hours later, the police arrived at the crime scene. Their first assumption was that the woman seemed to be around 30 years old. She had a hole the size of a fist in her left temple, along with everything else the park ranger had observed. Officers called what they saw ghastly. They said it was like she had been lying there, alone, or maybe on a blanket with someone, and a person bludgeoned her out of nowhere. There didn't seem to be any indications of a fight, and the sand had not even been disrupted. The day after she was found, authorities combed the vicinity for any evidence and clues as to who this victim was. They left the area empty-handed. The medical examiner said she had been deceased at least for a week. The pathologist, along with the medical examiner, extensively inspected her body for any identifying marks on her skin, internal injuries, or any remnants of strange or unknown substances. They didn't find anything on her body that would be helpful in identifying her, such as tattoos, scars, etc. But they did discover that she had been sexually assaulted with a wooden item, and presumably it happened post-mortem. The victim's cause of death was determined to be a blow to the head. For 2 days, a trainer and his Park Service bloodhound canvassed those dunes and didn't find a thing. Even the state police lab thoroughly analyzed the woman's clothing for any fingerprints, even laundry marks or distinguishing labels. They didn't find anything either. Officials found a few clues earlier, one being footprints that seemed to be approaching where the woman was discovered, but a few yards away from her, the footprints stopped. In the opposite direction of where she was found, someone had written SOS in the sand, but there was no way to know who wrote it or if they were even involved. One last thing the officers discovered 50 feet away from her were tire tracks that were heading to the dunes. Police Chief James Meads stated, quote, "They could have been connected or they could not have been connected. How do you know?" The investigation continued. A week later, fresh eyes would explore the landscape. There were 6 state officers and 2 Provincetown officers who surveyed the dunes and surrounding areas. Not only that, but they even drove out to motels, hotels, and rooming houses, attempting to find out if anyone staying in those places had left and didn't show back up again. That ended up being a trail leading to nowhere as well. The police got on their computer and compared the mystery woman's characteristics and appearance to thousands of missing persons. With no luck, they delivered a nationwide report stating there was a current search for an unknown white female who was 25 to 50 years old, 5'6" or 5'8" tall, and 140 to 150 pounds. During the first 3 weeks of July, there were vehicles that were licensed to drive on the dunes. So, authorities were given that list of licensed vehicles to investigate the owners of the vehicles as well as their family members. There were also vehicles and bicycles that had been deserted at the dunes. Officials looked into those owners and relatives as well, though their efforts were fruitless. There were a few clues that could possibly help in identifying her. Those clues were her teeth. The woman had gold sets on a few of her teeth, and there had been other dental work she had done that totaled between $5,000 and $8,000. Law enforcement knew there had to be a dentist out there that could help figure out who this woman was. The perpetrator may not have thought about the fact that her identity could be revealed by her dental records, but taking her hands was a sinister, cunning move by the killer. That person knew the police couldn't find out who she was without her fingerprints. On top of that, though, knowing her identity from her fingerprints would also expose where she was from, and eventually that would lead to people who knew her, and the closest people or person to her could become a suspect. The fact that this monster even thought to do that is exceptionally disturbing and bone-chilling. Authorities wanted so badly just to give this woman back her identity and for her not to be known only as the Lady of the Dunes. State officials mailed her dental chart to 5,000 dentists in Massachusetts alone, to dental societies and the FBI in 49 states, and they even sent them off to Royal Canadian Mounted Police and Interpol. Someone showed up to the police station who officials thought was going to crack the case. A dentist from Canada visited them, but that turned out to be quite peculiar. The dentist would show immense concern and curiosity about the unsolved murder, incessantly asking if it had been solved yet. Bizarrely, the man disappeared one day and couldn't be found. The Jane Doe was laid to rest in St. Peter's Cemetery, and her gravestone read, "Unidentified female, October 19th, 1974. The funeral director, Robert Roth, had a big heart, and he was clearly empathetic towards this woman and the monstrosity that happened to her. In experiencing those feelings very strongly, Robert Roth held a short service for her. For many years after, an unknown person would go put a small vase at her grave that contained flowers every July 26th. Quote, "It may sound sentimental, but I felt there should be some kind of service. After all, she was a human being. She might have wanted it," said Robert Roth. At the end of December 1974, authorities had not gotten far with their investigation. One of the detectives said, quote, "It's certainly unusual that no one misses her. She must have a husband, a boyfriend, parents, or someone. She had been pretty well taken care of. We know that." Authorities were at a complete loss. They didn't have any idea who killed this woman. There was no weapon, they didn't know if there was a motive, and there were not many clues to go by. As many as 30 police detectives had extensively combed the dunes and neighboring locations, but they never found anything. The officers were baffled, to say the least. Police Chief James Meads said, quote, "We're still working on it. We're hoping that if we can find out who she is, then maybe that will lead to whoever killed her. But it's hard work, and we haven't got much to go on." A detective and a lieutenant had a few suspects. Even though they had a tiny bit of faith that they might solve this case, they admitted that they were not very optimistic about it. As time passed, there wasn't much media coverage about the unknown woman, but in June of 1979, there was breaking news. A dentist who was also a state forensic examiner delivered the Jane Doe's mutilated skull to Dr. Clyde Snow. He led a team of physical anthropologists in Oklahoma City at the Civil Air Medical Institute. He and his group applied the woman's autopsy data to make a reconstruction of her face. The team studied her skin color, the thickness of her skin, bone structure, and soft tissue, piecing together the skull and jaw with wax to make this incredible reconstruction. The steps they took in order to make the reconstructed model is incredibly fascinating to me. The team, after creating the plaster cast of her recreated skull, harnessed their knowledge of dissection and performed x-rays to craft the softer areas with no bones, such as her ears and nostrils. After all of this was finished, a medical illustrator, Betty Gatliff, included some lines on the face depicting aging, and she added the color of her eyes and skin color. As soon as the model was completed, officers snapped photos of it. The pictures and flyers were given out to people in the community, and they were sent out to news outlets nationwide. The police chief now believed the woman was no older than 35, which shortened that age gap since at first they said that she could be anywhere between 25 to 50. Their investigation guided them down a new path as well. They were focusing on Providence, Rhode Island. Enough people had called out of that area after watching the news and said they positively recalled seeing that woman around Falmouth. Now the police's theory was that someone had possibly driven her from Boston to Falmouth, but they wouldn't reveal why they suspected that. The police chief of Provincetown, as mentioned earlier, was 46-year-old James Meads, and according to one newspaper, in his own words, allegedly he said he was obsessed with this case. Later, he would say that it wasn't an obsession and that he didn't say that. His determination and desire to unravel this mystery of who did this to her and to identify her all by himself was, to some, developing into an unhealthy fixation. It was one of those cases that he couldn't stop thinking about, one that really had a tight grip on him. James was adamant that he would come across the right lead and that he was going to get in touch with the right people who knew the identity of this woman. He was hell-bent on putting together the pieces of this puzzle that haunted him. Anytime someone called him with the smallest lead, he would frantically plunge into all the files in his possession that were filled with pictures of women who resembled her and every tip that had ever come in. The police chief had been saving these files and adding to them for 5 years at this point. James said, quote, "Even when I do get her identity, I still have to find the person who did this to her. I'm going to solve this case before I leave here. I'm not letting go. This is my case. Other officers have asked to work on this, but I guess I'm greedy. This one is mine." James recalled the day 5 years ago when the teenage girl called about a deceased body on the dunes. He said the area where she was discovered was plastered in blood, and the stench was overwhelming. He went on to talk about what he thought may have happened. Quote, "She must have been sharing the towel with someone because she was lying on only half of it. She was probably killed while she slept. Then, maybe in some act of remorse, the killer wrapped part of the towel over her." James suspected the murderer's weapon was likely a shovel, due to it being mandatory for people visiting the national seashore to have with them a shovel, tow rope or chain, and a low-pressure tire gauge. The police chief said that he would rarely ever not investigate a lead, because you never know when you could essentially get lucky. One of his theories was that this Jane Doe's death was somehow intertwined with homosexuality. He suspected she was from Boston and was a sex worker who regularly went to a bar in Falmouth. 4 people were under investigation in Rhode Island still, and James felt that one of these 4 suspects, if not all of them, were involved. In 1980, the woman's remains were exhumed so blood samples could be taken. DNA testing didn't exist yet, but they hoped one day there would be an advancement in testing. Her blood would hold more answers if ever there was a way that blood could be analyzed and tested for identification purposes. After that, a few years went by and not much was said about the case until 1983. At this point, James Meads had been the police chief of Provincetown for 12 years. People called him tough, stubborn, and tenacious. His need to solve this case never subsided. In 7 more years, he was to retire. James had worked on this case for almost 9 years now, relentlessly, and he vowed to solve it before he retired. Even though people had sent in hundreds of leads that led nowhere, investigators were constantly hitting dead ends, and all the frustration and stress that he felt, giving up was not an option to him. There were other things that caused him to be motivated to solve it himself, too. One being his pride. For the last 12 years that James Meads had been the police chief, This was the only unsolved murder case on the record. For him, being in charge when this young woman was killed, it was personal, especially in the way that she was sexually assaulted and mutilated. James felt since it was on his watch that this happened, he had a duty to make it right, to give the woman her identity back, and to find out who did this heinous, evil act. Quote, "It baffles me, not necessarily who killed the young lady, but who she is. The lack of identity bugs me. I'm fascinated. It's my case. I've never let anybody else touch it. When you put your heart and soul in a case, you really want to solve it. Some family has to be missing a loved one somewhere, and they have never come forward. That disturbs me. I think about that a lot. I keep going through the files to see if I've missed anything. The thing that really bugs me is this. I keep wondering if in all this massive paperwork is that one clue we haven't found. If ever the case is solved, I'll dig back in the files, and if it was there all along, I'm going to cry," said James. Personally, I can't help but think that James was being a tad selfish and wrong to not let anyone else help him with this young woman's case. Wouldn't having more officers help him with this case possibly have made a difference? I can't help but think that his pride and obsession clouded his better judgment on that, but what do you think? James was sure the killer had to be a man, due to the force and strength that it would require to take her life in the manner the person did. He still stood by his suspicion that a man in a four-wheel drive sand vehicle took her to the dunes, giving the impression that they would just be relaxing and laying out in the sun for the day. When James had gone down every avenue possible, he figured, why not try something a little different? He called a psychic who stated the young woman was a nurse from Ottawa, Canada. She also said her name was either Marilyn or Carolyn O'Leary. James sent these details over to officials in Canada, but as it turned out, the psychic was wrong. Just another dead end and disappointment. The police chief sent True Detective magazine and a publication called Search that specialized in missing persons cases all of the information about the case. He even desperately touched base with people he knew who had special connections in Rhode Island to find out if this had been a killing by the mob. By 1987, the young woman's unsolved murder story and pictures of the reconstructed model had spread worldwide. Unbelievably, there were still no answers at all. James spoke to the media to keep her story alive in the papers and anywhere he could. A reporter saw one side of James's office. There was a stack of papers standing 2 to 3 feet tall. They were all about the young woman. The reporter also spotted in the corner a cardboard box, and inside was her skull. James continued to work on the case. He had 3 more years before he had to retire. Detectives and others who were working on the case had either retired or had been reassigned to other cases. He told a reporter, quote, "With most murders, you try to figure out who the murderer was. I've spent years trying to figure out who the victim was. As the years dwindle on, more dentists will retire or die. More dental records will be lost, and the opportunity for identification will diminish. Maybe someone on death row will decide to cleanse his soul before he dies and confesses to this murder. It appears that someday I'll retire and the case still won't be solved, but I'm sure whoever follows me in this job, if they get a lead, they'll call me and I'll be ready. In 1992, James Meads retired, and the case was still unsolved. Though, as he said, whoever took over the case after him would let him know when they had a lead, and he would be waiting in the meantime. In 1993, there seemed to be a promising, plausible break in the case that came about due to another tragic murder. Thankfully, the killer was caught. Afterwards, suspicions arose about his potential involvement in the murder of the young woman at the dunes. In June of 1993, in Maryland, a man named Haddon Clark from the nearby town of Wellfleet pleaded guilty and was convicted of murdering 23-year-old Laura Hufteling. He suffocated her to death in her sleep in the fall of 1992. Haddon Clark took her body and buried her. The chief forensic pathologist of the FBI got involved and planned to have the, quote, Lady of the Dunes exhumed at some point that summer. Police wouldn't comment on Haddon Clark being a suspect or not. They did say he was a 40-year-old drifter who lived in Wellfleet, and he was under investigation regarding a 6-year-old little girl who went missing during Memorial Day weekend in 1986. She was from Silver Spring, Maryland, and at the time, Haddon Clark was living with his older brother right next door to the little girl's house. At the time, that's all that was public knowledge. I do believe that I read in one of the newspapers that he was convicted or tried for her murder. Provincetown police detective Warren Tobias said the investigation had never stopped, referring to the unidentified woman from the beach in Massachusetts, saying, quote, "The woman in the Dunes case has never gone away." James Meads had the woman's skull in a cardboard box for years in his office, and since he was retired, it was sent to the Smithsonian Institution. Her skull was handed over to a curator of forensic anthropology and an FBI agent who was a forensic expert. There was a lot of hope that her identity would be known soon. In 1996, Laurie Metcalfe, who had found the woman's body, passed away. In the summer of 1998, brand new developments emerged. It had been 24 years since the young woman had been found on Race Point Beach in 1974, and at long last, DNA testing existed. It came out in the newspapers that since approximately 1989, James Meads had an idea about who the young woman could possibly be. 1 year before Laurie Metcalfe stumbled across the body, a woman named Rory Jean Kessinger had escaped from prison, and no one ever saw her again. In the summer of 1998, a private investigator, Philip E. White Jr., found where Rory's mother lived. After talking to her, she agreed to take a blood test to find out if it was a match to the unidentified woman. Detective Warren wasn't ready to open up about any further breaking news just yet. Quote, "There are people with feelings in their lives we have to consider. Although the case is 24 years old, it does not make it any less painful for the people involved." The private investigator said, quote, "In my mind, the ultimate solution to this case is at hand in the very foreseeable future." Detective Warren also said, quote, "I don't think she was a poor innocent. I think she was a bad guy." While saying that, he had Rory Kessinger in mind, who had been a teenage runaway with a criminal record by the time she made it to Massachusetts. Allegedly, she used drugs, got involved with people who were selling drugs and guns, and supposedly was acquaintances or maybe friends with a few co-conspirators who had helped rob a bank. When she was 24 years old, she was wanted across the country. A police lieutenant was helping an officer take a traffic violation notice to a home in January of 1973. When Rory and a few others saw the police, they fled through the back door and ran for the woods. Rory, who was only in lingerie, tripped, falling to the ground, and the lieutenant caught her. She told the lieutenant that she had been raped. Another officer led her back to the home, and she attempted to slip his gun from his holster, but he shoved her into the house. The officer began calling for help when Rory cut the lights off, dashing off to hide in another room. When the police officer turned the lights back on, he saw Rory holding a gun, and she said, quote, "I'm sorry, but I have to kill you." The policeman made a split decision to dive towards her, knocking the gun out of her hand and out of the way. He threw her down on the floor and handcuffed her. Speaking on that scary situation that happened 25 years prior, the officer said, quote, "You would just not think that a nice-looking girl like that would kill you in a heartbeat." Rory was not yet done, though. Police transported her to the hospital, where she was successful at removing an officer's gun. She aimed it at him and yelled, "Die, you fucking pig!" This policeman was able to get the gun away from her as well. From there, she was charged with 2 counts of assault with intent to murder and sent to Plymouth County Jail. She never went to trial because she escaped, either the night of May 26, 1973, or early that next morning. Someone had gotten away with sneaking Rory a hacksaw blade. She went to the laundry room of the jail, tied together a bunch of sheets, then sawed away at the bars on the laundry room window until she could fit her whole body through there. With the sheets secured, she was able to shimmy her way down, and off she went into the darkness. It's suspected that someone may have been waiting in a car for her close to the jail, but she was gone, and either no one knew or never told where she was. Even though James Meads thought the unidentified woman could be Rory Kessinger, he couldn't actually do anything to prove or disprove it because DNA testing was not around yet. At the same time, he was relying on psychics, other tips and leads that came in. People were calling about their daughters, cousins, and nieces who were missing, but eventually they would all turn back up. There was also a prisoner who was constantly drawing these pictures of women or possibly a specific woman with no hands. he would never answer any questions and never talked about why he was drawing women without hands or anything. He died in prison during the investigation. If he did know anything at all, or whatever his reasons were for repeatedly drawing women with no hands, he took what he did or did not know to the grave with him. James Meads saw a striking resemblance between Rory Kessinger and the reconstruction model of the unknown woman. Investigators had to make sure that Rory fit the general profile of the victim before they were going to shell out a few pretty pennies for a DNA test. This meant anthropologists were going back to do more analyzations of the remains. They had to double-check everything so no mishaps would occur. They would re-examine the skull to verify age, gender, racial makeup, among other things. Then compare every finding to Rory. If she and the victim checked off the same boxes, resulting in matching or very similar general profiles, the DNA test would come after. On the 23rd of March, 2000, it was time to start the process of finding out if Rory was in fact the victim or not. That day, the victim's remains were exhumed and taken to the state medical examiner's office located in Boston. She had to be exhumed because lab crime techs could not remove any DNA from her skull to prove heredity. The medical examiner took a bone sample and sent it off to a lab where the victim's DNA would be analyzed and compared to 25-year-old Rory Kessinger's mother's blood sample. On December 16, 2000, investigators were overwhelmingly disappointed to find out Rory's mother's DNA was not a match to the victim. However, they were still not going to throw in the towel. For 26 years, this tragedy had loomed over them and the community of Provincetown. Everyone wanted the person who did this to her to be caught, of course, but even more, people just wanted her to have her identity again. In 2009, Staff Sergeant Warren announced he was prepared to retire at the end of April after devoting 35 years to the Provincetown Police Department. In 2010, the police distributed to the media a new composite picture of the victim. Then, 2 years later, 78-year-old James Meads, the man who was determined to solve this woman's case, who essentially was consumed by it, passed away at his home on Christmas night. He died after dealing with a brief illness, and he was surrounded by his family and friends. 10 years later, police distributed to the media a new composite picture of the victim. Forensic professionals renewed the reconstruction images using physical evidence, advanced software, and methods to create better, more accurate images. Chief Jeff Jaron said it was the closest likeness they'd ever had of her. Also, the woman's DNA had been added to the national and international law enforcement and missing persons database. The police chief called her murder one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in the world, and he wasn't wrong. Since the 70s, so many people have been immersed in this story, some even to an obsessive extent, but all were eagerly waiting for any new updates. As we know, many television shows, books, podcasts, and varieties of media have also been hooked on and captivated by the young woman who was only known for such a long time as the Lady of the Dunes. To also see the advances in technology throughout the years that have aided in solving so many cases has been phenomenal and fascinating as well. Chief Jaron was the 4th police chief in Provincetown to work on the case. He believed since there was no empty hotel, motel, or rooming house, and no abandoned car, that if she would have been from the area, he would think investigators and the whole team of people working on this would have found something by that time. The chief believed the young lady was not a Massachusetts resident, but a tourist who could have been from anywhere in the world, but not Provincetown. He said, quote, "We are hoping this will generate something. The hope is we just get her identified." He also mentioned that the internet was such a valuable resource and beneficial to reach people from all around the globe. In 2014, Kate Tuttle from the Boston Globe talked to book author Deborah Halber about web sleuths. By this time, social media was huge, and as Deborah said, web sleuths are an internet subculture. Web sleuthing alone could be a whole other episode about the positive and negative impacts of sleuthing, the do's and don'ts, but I digress. Deborah stated, quote, "I think it starts out with curiosity. Who doesn't love a mystery? But I think over time they become more involved in individual cases. They almost adopt them. It becomes a case of compassion. They really want to give this person back a name and provide closure for their family." Deborah Halber also has a book called The Skeleton Crew: How Amateur Sleuths Are Solving America's Coldest Cases, which I will likely check out myself. In 2015, Bruce Jackson oversaw the undergraduate biotechnology and forensic DNA science program at Massachusetts Bay Community College in Wellesley. He was also a researcher who had been studying the Lady of the Dunes case for many years. That year, he and 5 students went to the dunes where the victim had been discovered. Bruce Jackson passed away the following year, and the medical examiner's office decided to take the remains that Bruce had in his possession, which were tissue samples of one leg, left and right scapula, ribs, and hair samples. In 2018, the Jane Doe's case was back in the spotlight in a big way. Everyone was talking about a specific scene in the movie Jaws. Someone took a picture of the scene, and the photo fascinated every person who had been following or simply knew of the Lady of the Dunes story. Jaws was filmed on Martha's Vineyard by Cape Cod the summer the woman's life was taken. Stephen King's son, Joe Hillstrom King, had seen the young woman's composite picture and read a book about it, and a couple of weeks later, Jaws had a 40th year anniversary re-release in 2015. That's when this specific woman caught Joe's eye, and he believed for a split second in a scene that was filmed at the Vineyard's ferry dock where there was a crowd of people that he saw the unidentified woman. The scene with this lady in it, who does seem to fit the profile, is around 54 minutes into the movie. Joe said that you'd likely not notice her while casually watching the movie, but somehow he spotted her, who at the very least did appear to have a lot of traits as the victim. She was even wearing a blue bandana like the one found on the Jane Doe. Joe decided to do some deeper digging into the woman on set and the victim. They wore very similar clothes, and where Jaws was being filmed wasn't far from Provincetown. In 2018, he came out with his conjecture on his blog called Joe Hill's Thrills, where he wrote, quote, "I was watching in my usual tranced-out state of dreamy pleasure, and then, suddenly, found myself half lunging out of my seat, prickling with goose flesh. And now, suddenly, impossibly, there she was, life-size and looking over her shoulder at me. There for a moment in a busy crowd scene, and then gone." Joe hadn't stopped theorizing about it since. He said it was always in his subconscious and he couldn't let it go. It didn't take long for this to go viral on the internet. Joe's theory took the internet by storm. The picture was passed around on every social media platform where some people were sure it was her and others were skeptical. In 2015, when he first saw the look-alike, he made some calls and a reporter from Entertainment Weekly did everything they could to figure out who the extra in the movie was. But the reporter was told that an archivist at Universal Studios searched for the names of the extras in Jaws and couldn't find it. Also, the casting director for the movie had passed away in 2009. Joe knew that it could also just be a coincidence that the victim and the extra in the movie looked very much alike, and maybe there was nothing to his theory at all. Just in case, though, he did go to the police about it, because he hoped maybe it would reveal new information and possibly even help solve the case. Joe would have liked for the victim's DNA to be sent to a genealogical database. In doing so, there was a chance of tracking down a family member they could contact who could finally identify her. Quote, "That would be the most wonderful thing. She's someone's daughter, and it would matter to the people in law enforcement who have committed years to finding closure in the case." Joe spoke to an FBI agent about it, and the agent told Joe he may be onto something there. Joe stated, quote, "Odder ideas have cracked colder cases." In 2019, prosecutors were studying a new way to use DNA evidence and genealogy to produce stronger clues that would guide them in the right direction to uncover the answers to cold cases on Cape Cod and the islands. Cape and Islands District Attorney Michael O'Keefe said the woman known as the Lady of the Dunes was one of two cases that were their primary focuses of what they were analyzing and working on. The district attorney and others working on this couldn't give out a lot of information at the time, but essentially they were going to examine what was left of her remains. A DNA profile that was not the same kind that they had used before was required in this case. Investigators were checking out a specialized lab where the DNA they needed could be extracted. On October 31st, 2022, at long last, the victim of a horrible homicide had her identity again. One of the sad parts to me is James Meads wasn't alive for this moment. the moment he never gave up on and knew without a doubt would come. The woman who had been known for 48 long years as the Lady of the Dunes was identified as Tennessee native 37-year-old Ruth Marie Terry. Scientific techniques have improved greatly, and new ones have been made since the 70s, when there wasn't much they could do with DNA. One of those new methods is investigative genealogy. It mixes DNA analysis with traditional genealogy studies and historical data to create new investigative leads for crimes that have gone unsolved, in this case for decades. Investigative genealogy is what was used to identify the Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo. Ruth Marie Terry was born on September 8, 1936 in Tennessee. She was described by her family as a loving, caring, free spirit who desired to explore and have adventures outside of Tennessee. Ruth visited her family 4 months prior to her body being found. Ruth Terry's great-niece, Brittany Novangloski, told the NBC 10 Boston investigators in an exclusive interview, quote, "It was just earth-shattering to know that somebody so beautiful and so loved and so bright was taken like that. She was just brutalized and left that way with no dignity. It's very, very sad for us because she was up there for 50 years all by herself." Brittany also said her mother and grandmother never gave up their search for Ruth. Ruth had been in California with her husband, Guy Moldovan, the last they knew. Her family met Guy about a year before Ruth went missing. What they didn't know was this man had a sordid past. They noticed when Ruth was around Guy, she wasn't quite herself. Brittany said she was almost inaccessible when he was by her side. She said it was almost as if Guy owned her and believed that Ruth was his property. Another tidbit to add is that Guy was the one who called the family to tell them Ruth was missing. Brittany's great-grandfather went from Tennessee all the way to California in 1974 to hire a private investigator, because the last they knew, that's where she and Guy were. The private investigator told the family that someone sold everything Ruth owned and that Ruth had left California. Ruth was also known to use the aliases Terry Marie Vizina, Terry M. Vizina, and Terry Shannon. It's reported that Ruth had connections to California, Massachusetts, and Michigan. Guy Rockwell Moldovan was born on October 27, 1923. At the time Ruth was discovered, they were newly married and he was an antiques salesman. Ruth and Guy wed in Reno, Nevada in February of 1974. They had only been married merely 5 months when Ruth's body would be stumbled upon by a beagle and a little girl, Laurie Metcalfe. Guy also went by the names Raoul Guy Rockwell and Guy Moldovan Rockwell. He died on March 14, 2002 in California at 78 years old. Ruth Marie Terry was a daughter, sister, aunt, wife, and mother. Just a few hours before a press conference would be held to reveal the good news to everyone that Ruth now had her name and no longer had to be known as the Lady of the Dunes, state troopers contacted her family to let them know. Massachusetts State Police Colonel Christopher Mason said, quote, "Today we can finally say her name, Ruth Marie Terry. We hope today's announcement sheds some light on the many questions we've had for many years. To the people of Provincetown, Cape Cod, and the Commonwealth who never forgot her, thank you. Today's identification is not the end of the case or even the beginning of the end, but it does mark an important milestone. What we need to do now is to learn everything about Ruth Terry's life, what she did, where she went, who she was associated with, all in hopes that those details and that timeline will lead us to her killer." The special agent in charge of Boston's FBI unit, Joseph Bonavolanta, said, quote, "As investigators, cases like this one haunt us, and the agencies represented here today are constantly re-evaluating and coming up with new investigative strategies to try and advance them. We also realize that while we have identified Ruth as the victim of this horrific murder, it does not ease the pain for her family. Nothing can. But hopefully it answers some questions while we continue to look for her killer." An aunt of Ruth's had searched and searched for her niece in the 1970s. Ruth was loved, she was cared for, adored, and missed dearly. Sadly, the aunt who had searched for her has passed away, but detectives are going to be in contact with Ruth's family and friends. They also want to find out if Ruth left behind any written papers that might help them in the ongoing investigation to find who killed her. I mentioned that Ruth's husband, Guy, had a sordid past. He was a suspected murderer, not only in the case of Ruth Marie Terry, but he was also a murder suspect back in 1960 for his second wife, Manzanita, and her daughter, Dolores Mearns, in Seattle, Washington. In the septic tank of their home and business, their remains were discovered. Guy immediately left Seattle. He was caught in New York City months later and arrested by the FBI. He was charged with unlawful flight in order to avoid being interrogated about the mutilation of his wife and stepdaughter. Not only that, but Guy had also conned his third wife's family out of $10,000 around the time his second wife, Manzanita, disappeared. He was facing larceny charges, and in 1961, he was convicted for them and was sentenced to a maximum of 15 years. However, the next year, after serving 15 months, his sentence would be suspended if he agreed to reimburse the money, and he, of course, took the deal. As of November 3rd, 2022, NBC 10 Boston reported an investigation into whether murder charges had ever been filed against Guy involving his second wife and her daughter. Reportedly, he was never charged. Currently, investigators are trying to work with the authorities in Seattle. Guy Moldavan was also the main suspect in another murder that happened in June of 1950 in Humboldt County, California. 28-year-old Henry Baird was killed, and his 17-year-old girlfriend, Barbara Jo Kelly, went missing. When Ruth's great-niece Brittany was asked what she thought when she found all this out about Ruth's husband, she replied, quote, "Knowing what we know now and seeing it, it would be very shocking if it was not him." She also said she wants everyone to know Ruth was very loved, she was beautiful inside and out, and deserves justice. Anyone with information about Ruth Marie Terry and Guy or Raoul Rockwell's whereabouts in 1973 and 74 in the New England area, specifically Massachusetts and Cape Cod, are asked to contact the Massachusetts State Police at 1-800-KAPTURE. That's 1-800-CAPTURE with a K. You can also send an email to msptips@pol.state.ma.us, or you can even send a text message to 226787. The text message must start with the word MSP Tips. No spaces, just MSP TIPS, and then the information you have. Also, please use that contact information if you know anything about people who were associated with either of them. All tips are very helpful and important. Since this investigation is still ongoing to find Ruth's killer, I will do an update episode in the future. As of the release of this episode, officials have said they will start an investigation today to find out who murdered Ruth. I'm going to wait until there is a conclusion to this case to do that, and not put out an episode every time a newspaper headline pops up. Personally, I think they will find out who killed her fairly soon. I don't think it will be a long wait, but that's only my guess. I do believe all signs point to her husband, but as we know, anything is possible in this cruel world, and my guess could be wrong. I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode about Ruth Marie Terry. I want to say thank you to the sweet jailbirdies on patreon.com/ReverieTrueCrime. Thank you to Lorraine, Chelsea, Matt, Jade, Badcast Company, TZ, Angel, Justin, Dooley, Rob, Stephanie, Steve, and Rachel. Until next time, everyone, please stay safe and make sure to take care of yourselves and one another.